The town square was bustling with life. Under a clear sky, crowds of people were enjoying the warmth of the day. Street musicians played jazz, teenagers skateboarded, and tourists clicked their cameras. In the center of this world, which seemed to breathe freedom, a young girl in a wheelchair was making her way. Her name was Amira. She was used to her disability eliciting stares, pitying, wary, sometimes even contemptuous. But today, something was different. A stranger's gaze burned down her back, too long, too heavy. When she turned around, she saw a man in a police uniform standing there, his face twisted with indignation. His jaw was tense, his eyes narrowed, and his hand rested involuntarily on his baton. Amira felt an alarm rising inside. He took a step toward her. "Hey, you?" His voice sounded like a lash. "What are you doing here? Excuse me?" Amira raised her head, trying to look confident. "I'm just going home." "Home?" There was mocking disbelief in his tone. "Does a wheelchair user also break the order? Do you know how many people like you roam the streets? I'm warning you, I don't want them home." His words came over her like a wave, and Amira felt her blood run cold. It seemed to her that all the noise in the square had died down. "I didn't do anything," she said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly. "Nothing?" He took a sharp step closer, hovering over her. "I think you're disturbing the others. You're provoking a crowd. You want to start a riot?" His hand reached for the stroller, and Amira instinctively clutched at the armrests. "Don't touch me!" Her voice trailed off, but she couldn't afford to break. "Don't touch?" He smirked, and there was something dark, dangerous in his eyes. "I have the authority to do whatever I need to do to restore order." At that moment, the crowd around them began to slow down. People threw glances, but no one intervened. Someone pulled out a cell phone and started taking pictures. But Amira knew it wouldn't help now. "You think the laws don't apply to you because you're in a wheelchair? Or because—" He paused and glared at her. "You think your skin color gives you privileges?" Her breathing became frequent. The questions left no room for doubt. This man had come here to break her. She didn't know how it would end, but she felt something coming, something big and irreversible. "I won't let you treat me like this," she said louder than she expected herself to, but instead of answering, the policeman roughly grabbed the handle of her stroller and yanked it sharply. The people around her gasped. Amira almost flew forward, but she managed to hold on. "That's how you won't let me," he said with a sneer, pushing her aside like an unwanted object. "You have no rights. You're nothing." She pressed her lips together to keep from screaming, but something new flashed in her eyes. Not fear, but defiance. She reached for the phone. She needed to make a call. The man who could change everything was only minutes away from her. "You're going to regret this a lot," she whispered. But he only laughed, loudly, without a shadow of a doubt, not even realizing the nightmare he had just caused. Amira felt her stroller being shoved backwards as if it were trash that was in the way. She lost her balance, and her hands frantically grasped the armrest to keep from falling. Anger and humiliation swept over her like fire, but she felt the growing fear even more strongly. The policeman didn't even try to hide his contempt. "Get off!" he bellowed, grabbing the stroller with both hands. "What are you doing?" she shouted, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's my stroller. You have no right." "Right?" he snorted, dragging her away from the girl like she was an old cart. "Your rights end where mine begin. I'll tell you what you can or can't do." The words cut her like a knife. Amira, without her stroller, felt defenseless and humiliated. She tried to reach forward to grab the stroller, but was unsuccessful. The policeman leaned towards her defiantly and said, "That's the problem with you. You think the world owes you something? You must be the kind of person who lives on welfare and sits around all day blaming everyone else for your hard life." His words caused a murmur in the crowd. People began to whisper, but no one dared to come closer. Some looked frightened, others disappointed, but most seemed simply indifferent. Only a few people held up their phones recording what was happening, but no one tried to intervene. "Please, give me back the stroller," Amira said, trying to keep her voice calm even though everything inside was seething. The policeman paused, as if enjoying her plea. Then he put the wheelchair a few paces away from her and folded his arms across his chest. "Do you want her back?" he said, nodding mockingly at the stroller. "Crawl." The crowd gasped. Someone muttered, "It's too much," but no one stepped forward. Amira froze in place, her heart pounding frantically. She couldn't believe her ears. "Crawl," he repeated, pointing with a grin at the baby carriage. "Or do you think I'm going to serve it to you on a silver platter?" His words ignited something in her. Anger swept over her, displacing her fear. Amira clenched her fists, glaring at the policeman defiantly. "I'm not going to take your humiliating orders," she said, her voice trembling but her eyes sparkling. "You won't?" He leaned closer, his face only a few inches from hers. "You seem to forget who's in charge." He turned to the crowd and added loudly, "Look at her. She thinks she's better than everyone else. It doesn't matter if you're in a wheelchair or not. The laws are the same for everyone. But some people think they're above the law." His words, clearly intended to humiliate and denigrate her in front of the others, caused a mixture of shock and awkwardness in the crowd. But no one still didn't move. "I have proof of your cruelty," Amira said, pulling out her phone. Her voice was weak but firm. "This video will be seen by everyone." The policeman snatched the phone from her hands and threw it to the ground. There was a crunch of broken glass. "That's better," he said coldly. "You can't prove anything now." Amira felt tears rolling down her cheeks. She couldn't hold them back any longer. Her whole being screamed with humiliation, anger, and helplessness. "You will answer for this," she whispered, feeling her lips quiver. "You're going to be responsible for this if you don't shut up," he growled, coming menacingly closer to her. But at that moment, a low voice echoed through the crowd. "You made your last mistake." Everyone turned around. A tall man in an austere suit was approaching the square in quick strides, his face like stone. The policeman didn't immediately realize who it was, but the look on Amira's face, full of hope and anger, told him that his day was about to get a lot worse. Amira breathed heavily, feeling her body shackled to the ground under the weight of helplessness. The policeman continued to stand beside her wheelchair like a trophy weapon, and in his eyes was the cold certainty of his own untouchability. The crowd froze, but no one dared to intervene. Only a whisper broke through the tense silence. "Give me the wheelchair." Amira's voice was muffled, but there was a firm determination in it. "You have no right to treat me like this." He snorted, as if he'd heard some ridiculous joke. "Right?" he repeated with a sneer, crossing his arms over his chest. "What rights do you have, girl? You think someone like you can dictate anything to me?" Amira raised herself on her arms, but her attempts looked pathetic. The policeman looked down at her with contempt. "I'll tell you one thing," he continued, glancing at the crowd. "People like you always want to be pitied. You think because you're in a wheelchair you can do anything? I'll tell you, no. The laws are for everybody, and I'm going to make sure you remember that." He shoved the stroller with his foot, and it rolled on. Amira cried out. Her stroller, her only way to get around, was now out of reach. "Why are you doing this?" Her voice was full of despair. "Because I can," he said coldly, "and you have to learn that life isn't a walk in the park, even if you're rolling on wheels." At that moment, someone in the crowd couldn't stand it. A young man, about 20 years old, stepped forward. "Hey, that's enough. This is too much." His voice was firm, but there was a hint of fear in it. The policeman turned to him with squinted eyes. "Did you say something?" His tone was menacingly calm. "Yes, I did." The boy hesitated but continued. "You have no right to treat a man like that." The policeman took a step forward, forcing the young man to step back. "And you want to go to jail for resisting an officer?" he growled. "Or do you have to explain how the laws work, too?" The guy fell silent, and the crowd retreated into silence again. This was exactly what the officer wanted. Total control. "No one?" He looked around at the people around him. "No one else wants to check my credentials?" Through this theater of humiliation, Amira still tried to struggle. She looked at the people around her, hoping for help, but saw only averted eyes and frightened faces. "Do you know who my father is?" she said at last, gathering her last strength. The policeman laughed again, now loud and mocking. "Another fairy tale daddy who's going to fix everything? Well, give it a shot. Call your daddy. See if he can get you out of this mess." He emphasized the word dirt, saying it with a hateful grin. To him, she was just another piece in his game, an object to demonstrate his power. But Amira wasn't about to give up any more. She knew her father was coming, and she knew that the man would regret his actions. Her mind was spinning. How many times had this happened to others, to those who had no support, who had no one to intervene? The policeman walked over to her wheelchair again and put it in the middle of the road. "Just like that, for all to see," he said, looking out over the crowd. "Let this be a lesson to anyone who thinks that disability or skin color gives them the right to spit on order." Those were the last words he spoke before a dark car came around the corner and stopped in front of him. The door opened, and out stepped a man with a face as cold as if carved from stone. The policeman didn't realize it yet, but his whole world began to crumble at that second. Amira sat on the ground, feeling the cold concrete seeping through her body to her bones. Her wheelchair stood in the distance, like a mute witness to her humiliation, and the policeman looked around the crowd proudly, as if enjoying his victory. But the stares of those around them were no longer so indifferent. The crowd was divided. Some clutched their phones, filming what was happening but not moving. Others turned away, pretending that nothing was happening. But there were also those who, barely noticeable to themselves, began to stand on one side. "This is outrageous," came the voice of a woman in her 40s. She stepped forward, her face a mixture of anger and horror. "You have no right to treat this girl like this." The policeman turned to her with a smirk. "What are you going to do to me?" he said, crossing his arms. "Write a complaint?" "Oh, I beg your pardon. Are we having a virtue meeting here?" The woman faltered, but didn't back down. "You use your power to humiliate people. It's wrong." Her voice sounded firm, but she didn't move closer. "Wrong?" He took a step toward her, and she instantly backed away. "Don't you think I'm not here to entertain you? Or do you want to join her?" There were whispers in response. Someone in the crowd said loudly, "He's just doing his job." Maybe she provoked it. The words were like a stab in the back to Amira. She turned to the person who had spoken, a man in a business suit who seemed to be in a hurry to get to work. His face showed irritation, as if this incident was interfering with his schedule. "Provoked?" shouted another woman, young and clearly agitated. "Do you see that she is in a wheelchair? How could she provoke someone?" "You don't know the whole story," the man snapped. "Maybe she did break the law. We're not judges here," the crowd murmured. Some agreed with him, others resented him. Arguments arose that didn't concern Amira directly, but made her part of someone else's game. She was no longer a person, but an object to be discussed. "I think he's doing the right thing," came the voice of an older man in a hat. "This neighborhood is getting worse. The police are trying to clean up the neighborhood, and people like her are just getting in the way." Amira clenched her fists. She wanted to scream, to explain to everyone that she hadn't done anything, that this was baseless cruelty, but her voice was weaker than their arguments. "You all just stand there and watch this man abuse her," shouted the young man, the one who had tried to intervene earlier. "It's none of our business," muttered an elderly woman standing nearby. "The less we interfere, the better for everyone." These words were said too loudly, and the policeman heard them. He laughed. "See?" he said, looking around the crowd. "Most people here understand that I'm doing my job, and if anyone disagrees, welcome to the station." "You are turning the law into an instrument of hate," the same young man shouted. "Hate?" The cop took a step toward him, and the guy instinctively backed away. "I am the law." Meanwhile, Amira felt her hands shaking. She saw the faces of the people who justified what was happening, and their indifference hurt more than the officer's words. "Is no one going to help me?" Her voice sounded louder than she expected, but still didn't reach those who had already decided to turn away. One of the men filming what was happening on his phone muttered, "We're taking notes. This will become evidence." But taking notes wasn't enough. Amira realized that no one wanted to take risks. Everyone was making excuses for their inaction. The crowd slowly began to disperse. People were leaving, muttering to themselves that they had things to do, that it wasn't their problem. But Amira's gaze stopped on the approaching figure. Her heart twitched. This man was the only hope that could put an end to what was happening. The policeman also noticed the movement and turned around. He saw a man walk up to the girl and lift her off the ground. His face was calm, but his eyes showed fury. "You've done enough," the man said coldly. "Now you're going to answer for everything." The crowd stopped. People, already ready to leave, froze again. The policeman felt his confidence begin to waver, but he did not yet know that before him stood the man whose name would change everything. Amira felt as if the ground was slipping away from under her feet. The circle of indifferent faces around her was like a stone wall that only increased her sense of isolation. The pain of humiliation and cold fear stiffened her movements, but there was something more burning inside, a desire to resist. She knew there was one person who could change this situation, and despite her trembling hands and tear-damp eyes, she reached into her pocket. Her cell phone, cracked from being abandoned by the cop, still worked. The screen glowed, and she looked away from the officer's angry figure and hurriedly entered the number. "Where are you calling?" the policeman said contemptuously, leaning over her. "To complain to the kindergarten?" Amira paid no attention to him. A familiar low voice came from the other end of the line. "Daddy," she began, but her voice trailed off. She paused to pull herself together. "Daddy, I need help. A policeman pulled me over. He took my stroller and he's humiliating me in front of everyone." The voice on the other end became instantly serious. "Where are you?" the man asked, and his words sounded like an order. "Central Square," she said quickly. "I'm on my way. Are you safe?" His voice sounded cold, but there was an undercurrent of rage in it. "For now, yes," she started, but the policeman snatched the phone out of her hands. "Hey!" Amira shouted, but he only grinned. "Who is it?" the officer said mockingly, holding the phone to his ear. "Hello, you're talking to the police. What do you want?" There was silence at the other end. Then a voice, low and commanding, said, "You have no idea who you're talking to." The policeman raised his eyebrows, the smile on his face growing even wider. "Oh, really?" he said with a sneer. "And who are you? Another lawyer with a big mouth, perhaps?" "It doesn't matter," the voice said, its tone threatening. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. We'll see if you have the courage to continue." The policeman seemed to be enjoying the situation. He broke off the conversation, dropping the phone at Amira's feet. "Anyone can puff up their cheeks on the phone?" he said dismissively, turning to the crowd. "Another great savior. How funny." But questions began to arise in the crowd. People whispered, some of them recognizing Amira's face, her surname, which began to sound louder and louder. "That's her father," someone said. "Do you think it's true?" asked the other. The policeman noticed this agitation, but his self-confidence did not waver. He leaned toward Amira, his voice icy. "You can call anyone you want, but it doesn't change the fact that you're a troublemaker. You're nobody here, and neither is your daddy." His words were full of contempt, but Amira noticed his hands trembling faintly. She didn't respond. She knew her father would be here soon, and then the man would regret every word he said. A few minutes passed, but the atmosphere in the crowd was becoming more and more tense. People were waiting for the denouement. Someone had turned on the live broadcast, and comments flashing on the screen indicated that the video was already circulating on the internet. Finally, the noise of an engine caused the crowd to look around. A black car pulled into the square, its doors opened, and out stepped a tall man in an austere suit. His face was like chiseled stone, and his gaze burned all around him. The policeman tensed slightly but tried to maintain his confidence. "Is that it?" he said, looking the man over. "Well, let's talk." But instead of answering, the man stepped straight toward Amira. His gaze remained cold, but there was fury in it. He picked up the phone from the ground, giving the policeman a murderous look, and without a word he handed it back to his daughter. "Are you okay?" he asked Amira. She nodded, but her eyes spoke more than words. The man turned to the policeman, and his voice cut through the air. "You just made your last mistake." The man who had just stepped out of the car seemed the embodiment of calm menace. He stood motionless, his dark suit accentuating his broad shoulders, his cold eyes silencing those who were still whispering. His whole appearance spoke of a man accustomed to control, to power. There was a tension in the air that was impossible to ignore. The policeman, seeing the man approaching, smirked at first, but then his confidence wavered slightly. There was something about the man that made the officer instinctively wary. "Who are you?" he asked, trying to maintain his authority. The man ignored the question. He slowly walked over to Amira, bent down and lifted her off the ground as if it were the most natural action in the world. "You're not hurt?" he asked quietly, looking into her eyes. "I'm fine, Daddy," she replied, but her voice trembled. His look of concern was instantly replaced by an icy one as he turned to the officer. "Are you the man who decided to humiliate my daughter?" he asked calmly, but his voice was threatening. "Oh, so you're her father?" The policeman laughed, trying to hide his growing concern. "Look, sir, it doesn't matter. Your daughter was out of order, and I'm doing my job." "Doing your job?" the man repeated, taking a step forward. His voice lowered and his gaze grew colder. "Tell me, how exactly is it your job to humiliate a helpless girl?" "Look, I don't have to answer you," the officer snarled, trying to maintain control of the situation. But the crowd began to whisper louder. People began to recognize the man. Someone took out his cell phone and started searching for his name on the internet. After a few seconds, a voice came from the crowd. "It's Elijah Matthews." The name sounded like a clap of thunder. The policeman frowned, his self-confidence beginning to waver visibly. "Elijah Matthews?" someone in the audience said in amazement. "The Elijah Matthews? The head of the National Human Rights Council?" The crowd became animated. Those who had initially justified the policeman's actions now looked confused. "If it's him, the officer is screwed," someone whispered. The officer clenched his teeth. He had obviously heard the name before, but he tried not to show his excitement. "It doesn't matter who you are," he said, but his voice grew quieter. "The law is the law." "Law?" Elijah said the word as if tasting it. "The law doesn't give you the right to strip people of their dignity. The law doesn't allow you to turn your uniform into an instrument of terror." He turned to the crowd, his voice amplified, filling the entire area. "How many others like you?" he pointed to the officer. "Hide behind a badge, using power to humiliate and suppress? That's not serving the law. That's desecrating it." The policeman took a step back, but tried to look confident. "They're just words," he muttered. "You have no basis for accusations." Elijah stepped closer, making the officer feel a head shorter. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "Everything you did today was written down. Every cruel thing you did, every humiliating word you said." The crowd began to whisper louder. People pulled out their phones, watching the broadcast that had already begun to go viral on social media. "That video is already on the internet," said someone in the crowd. "This officer will be fired by morning." The policeman turned pale. He realized he was losing control of the situation, but he tried to hold on. "You can't threaten me," he said, but there wasn't the same confidence in his voice. Elijah grinned, but there was no warmth in his smile. "I'm not threatening," he said. "I'm just saying that justice will catch up with you. And soon." His words sounded like a sentence. The policeman turned around, looking at the crowd which was no longer on his side. Now everyone was waiting for the denouement, and he realized that his time was running out. "You made a mistake," Elijah added, his voice almost a whisper, but it was a whisper everyone could hear. "And the consequences will be something you'll remember for the rest of your life." The policeman tried to object, but the words stuck in his throat. At that moment, another car entered the square, and people began to step aside to let the man in a strict uniform through. The officer was called to report. But this was only the first step in a chain of events that would change his fate forever. When the black car stopped at the edge of the square and Elijah Matthews stepped out of it, time seemed to slow down. The crowd, which a moment ago had been arguing and whispering, now stood silent. Every eye was fixed on the tall figure of a man who moved with silent confidence. His steps were measured, and his face retained an icy calm. The policeman felt a chill run down his spine. He tried not to show his anxiety, but the tense shoulders and the corner of his mouth twitching involuntarily gave it away. "So, you're the father she summoned?" the officer said, but his voice was lower, lacking his former self-assurance. Elijah walked over to Amira, ignoring him. He dropped to one knee beside his daughter, checking her condition. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper, but there was a depth of hidden rage in it. Amira nodded, but the tears in her eyes spoke for themselves. "He took my stroller," she whispered, trying to keep her cool. "He said I was a nobody." The words made Elijah freeze for a moment. He stood up, as if he had doubled in size, his gaze fixed on the policeman. It was all in that gaze: anger, judgment, power. "Did you say she was a nobody?" Elijah's voice was low, almost hissing, but it pierced the air like thunder. The policeman took a step back, but was still trying to save face. "Look, sir," he began, trying to sound firm. "This was a simple case of disorderly conduct. I followed procedures." "Procedures?" Elijah raised an eyebrow. He stepped closer, and the officer felt something squeeze his throat. "Procedures that involve humiliating disabled people? Procedures that let you forget that there's a human being in front of you?" The crowd stirred. Elijah's words sounded like a rebuke that penetrated the hearts of all present. Someone murmured softly, "It's the end for him." The policeman tried to resist. "Sir, I was acting within the law. She refused to comply." Elijah laughed, but it was a laugh without joy. "Obey? Obey what? Your ego? Your preconceived notions?" His words were like a lightning strike, and the policeman could no longer hide his uncertainty. "Look," he tried to regain control, but there was panic in his voice. "It's just a misunderstanding. Maybe I've been too harsh, but..." Elijah took another step forward, forcing the officer to step back. "You took her wheelchair. You humiliated her in front of everyone. You used the power to suppress, not protect. And you say, 'but'?" With those words, he turned to the crowd, his voice louder, filling the plaza. "How many more like him will use their uniforms to assert their power at the expense of the weak? How many more people will remain silent because they are afraid of people like him?" The crowd responded with murmurs. People who had initially excused the officer now looked confused, even guilty. Those who were filming raised their cameras even higher so as not to miss a single word. The policeman was cornered but tried to remain calm. "I'm willing to cooperate," he muttered, his voice becoming barely audible. "Cooperate?" Elijah said the word as if tasting it. "No, you'll be responsible. To me, to my daughter, to everyone who's ever been hurt by someone like you." At that moment, another car arrived at the scene. 2 men in strict suits got out of it. They walked quickly, their faces tense. One of them approached the policeman and whispered something in his ear. The officer's face turned pale. "Who are they?" someone in the crowd asked. "They're lawyers," replied the other, "and they seem to be very powerful." The officer realized that the situation was out of his control. He tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. His career, his reputation, everything he knew was hanging by a thread. Elijah stepped even closer, his voice quiet, almost intimate, but there was a steely menace in it. "You have no idea who you're messing with, but you will, very soon." The policeman did not answer. He knew the battle was lost. The crowd watched the whole thing with bated breath. They realized they were witnessing something more than just a personal conflict. This was a moment of justice that could change everything. Elijah Matthews stood a few feet away from the policeman, and the crowd around him held its breath. His whole appearance radiated a calm power that held everyone in suspense. But behind that outward equanimity was a rage boiling inside. This rage was not just for Amira, but for everyone who had ever faced injustice, for everyone who had suffered in silence. "I'm waiting," he said quietly, but his voice echoed in the silent crowd. "What exactly are you waiting for?" the policeman asked, trying to keep his voice firm, but his nervousness was evident. His hands were shaking, his breathing confused. "I told you, I was doing my duty. I'm waiting for you to apologize," Elijah said, looking straight into his eyes. His voice was icy, but there was such power in it that even the bravest of the onlookers hesitated to whisper. "Apologized for every humiliating word, every cruel action. Here, now, to my daughter and to all these people." "Look," the officer began, arching his back to give himself importance. "I wasn't doing anything illegal. She was disruptive. Disturbing the order." Elijah interrupted him abruptly. "Tell me, in what way was this girl disruptive? What was it about her actions that threatened you? A cop with a gun, a baton, and power?" The policeman was silent. For a moment, he looked like he was ready to say something, but then he looked away. The crowd murmured. Some shouted outraged phrases, others recorded the officer's every move on their cameras. "You won't say anything because there's nothing to say," Elijah continued. His voice grew louder, his resolve steely. "Because you weren't defending the law. You were protecting your illusion of power. You humiliated my daughter to make yourself feel stronger." "That's not true," the policeman said, taking a step back. His face turned ash gray. "Then explain to us how it happened." Elijah stepped forward, forcing the officer to back away some more. "Explain to the people why you saw fit to humiliate a young girl in a wheelchair. We're all listening." The officer looked back at the crowd. Her moods were no longer neutral. Now they were looks of accusation, contempt, and indignation. Even those who had initially supported him were beginning to question their position. "Yeah, I was just following protocol," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Protocol?" Elijah repeated with a sneer. "What exactly is the protocol that allows you to take people's wheelchairs away from them? What protocol justifies your humiliation and aggression?" The policeman couldn't find the words. He could see that the situation was spiraling out of control. The crowd grew louder and louder, and the cameras pointed at him recorded his every gesture, his every attempt to defend his actions. "I don't have to apologize," he finally said, but his voice was weak. "I acted like a professional." These words caused laughter in the crowd. Someone shouted loudly, "Professional? What are you talking about?" "Professional?" Elijah interjected, and his face hardened even more. "You call that professional?" He turned to the crowd, and his voice grew louder, stronger. "How many more of these professionals will use their power to intimidate? How many more people have to suffer before the system changes?" These words elicited an overwhelming response. People began to shout their stories of injustice. Some cried, some swore. The crowd were no longer just spectators. They became part of the moment. The policeman, seeing that the situation was out of his control, tried to pull himself together. "Look," he began, turning to Elijah. "I realize that I may have been out of line, but I acted with the best of intentions." "With the best intentions?" Elijah interjected coldly. "The best intentions are to humiliate my daughter, taking her stroller, insulting her in front of dozens of people?" The policeman answered nothing. "You won't say anything because you have nothing to say," Elijah continued, his voice filled with an icy calm. "But know this, You're going to answer for everything, and your apology is just the first step." "You can't talk to me like that." The officer tried to object, but his voice was barely audible. "You think that's a threat?" Elijah leaned closer, his eyes burning with rage. "No, it's a promise." The crowd erupted in applause. The policeman stood still as if he had been pinned to the ground. He realized that this moment would change his life forever. "Apologize to her," Elijah demanded, looking straight into the officer's eyes. The policeman hesitated, but under the weight of the crowd's stares and Elijah's might, he finally spoke through gritted teeth. "I'm sorry." "Louder, so everyone can hear," Elijah said without averting his gaze. "I'm sorry," the officer repeated, but there was no sincerity in his voice. "You'll have your answer," Elijah concluded, turning to his daughter in the crowd. The officer realized that this was more than just an apology. It was the beginning of the end of his career and reputation, and everyone in the crowd knew it. The day after the incident, the central square no longer resembled a chaotic field of tense drama, but a real storm raged on the internet. The video of Amira's humiliation, her father's humiliation, and the confrontation that erupted spread across social networks, gaining millions of views. Comments were full of anger, outrage, and calls for justice. The name of the policeman, David Collins, was now known to everyone. It seemed like the case would be resolved quickly. An on-camera apology might have been the formal end of the conflict, but for Elijah Matthews it was only the beginning. He knew there was more behind every incident like this. It wasn't a personal feud, but a problem with a system that allowed people like Collins to act with impunity. Immediately after the incident, Elijah sprang into action. His team of lawyers and activists joined the investigation, launching a full-scale campaign against the police department. Within days, shocking facts came to light. The Amira incident was not the first case of brutality and discrimination by David Collins. Case 1. 3 years ago, Collins stopped a young black man under the pretext of suspicious behavior. The man was severely beaten, and his charges against the officer were later dismissed due to lack of evidence. Case 2. A Hispanic woman filed a complaint alleging that Collins had mistreated her, threatened to arrest her, and racially abused her. Her complaint remained unanswered. Case 3. A teenager from a disadvantaged neighborhood accused Collins of beating him, but the case was dismissed for lack of witnesses. Each new case was a hammer blow to the reputation of the police department. Internal reports surfaced that proved that complaints about Collins came in regularly, but that management preferred to ignore them. Elijah held a press conference at which he presented documents proving a systematic cover-up of such crimes. He stood in front of the cameras, his voice firm, his face tense. "This is not an isolated incident," he said, showing copies of the reports. "It's not just one person's mistake. It is the consequence of a system that allows its representatives to act with impunity if they think their power puts them above the law." The press conference caused a huge backlash. The police department, cowed by the pressure of public opinion, reluctantly announced an internal investigation. But for Elijah, it wasn't enough. "We demand more than an investigation," he said. "We demand reform, transparency, and justice." Meanwhile, Collins himself tried to defend himself. In a TV interview, he presented himself as the victim of a witch hunt. "My job has always been difficult," he said into the camera, his voice shaking. "I acted in the interest of public safety. I'm not a racist, I'm just an officer doing my job." But these words found no support. The released videos, victim testimonies, and internal documents made his position unconvincing. His face became a symbol of all that was wrong with the law and order system. When public pressure reached its peak, the resignation of several high-ranking police officials became inevitable. The head of the department issued a statement in which he acknowledged the errors of the department. "We are responsible for the actions of our employees and are committed to reviewing our internal procedures," he said. But his words came too late. Reports of dozens of other instances of discrimination and abuse in the department were soon published. Collins was just the tip of the iceberg that began to erode the reputation of the entire system. Meanwhile, Amira was trying to cope with the consequences of having her name in the public eye. Her face appeared on every news channel, in every social media post. People supported her, but with it came threats and hatred from those who defended Collins. "I didn't want all this," she admitted to her father. "I just wanted justice for myself." "You got more than justice," Elijah said, hugging her. "You helped show the world that no one should have to put up with that kind of treatment." A few weeks later, Collins was charged with abuse of authority, malfeasance, and several other crimes. His dismissal was only the first step toward retribution. At the court hearing, he looked pale and broken. Elijah attended every session, sitting next to his daughter. For him, it was not only a personal battle, but a fight for those who never got justice. The incident in the square catalyzed reforms in the law enforcement system. New transparency rules, mandatory anti-discrimination training, and an independent body to investigate complaints were introduced. Elijah wasn't going to stop. He knew the road to true justice would be long, but now he had more allies than ever. At one of the reform rallies, Elijah addressed thousands of people. Amira stood beside him, strong and confident. "Each of us has the right to dignity," he said, "and we will never let that right be taken away." The crowd responded with loud applause. This was not just a victory of one family. It was a victory of people fighting for a better future. The trial against David Collins had become a real sensation. Tension reigned in the courtroom, and every eye was fixed on the officer, who now looked broken. Dozens of witnesses whose lives he had ruined by his brutality appeared before the court. His defense attorneys tried to put it down to difficult working conditions, but the evidence and video were undeniable. When the judge handed down the sentence, imprisonment for abuse of power and violation of civil rights, the hall erupted in applause, but Amira and Elijah felt no relief. For them, it was not a moment of triumph, but a reminder of the pain they had been through. Collins's resignation was only the beginning of a chain reaction. The police department lost public confidence, and a number of high-ranking officials were fired. Reforms began, but their path was long and winding. For Amira, it was a moment to finally get back to her life. But the scars left by that experience remained. She knew she would never look at people with the same trust again. "You've made the world a little better," Elijah told her one night. "But it cost a lot," she replied. A few weeks later, Collins was found dead in his cell. Officially, it was ruled a suicide, but public controversy erupted. Some believed his death was the result of unspoken revenge. For others, it was just another confirmation of the depth of the problems in the system. Elijah stared at the news for a long moment before turning off the screen. He knew that this case would be another chapter in the fight for justice that had just begun. This story left an indelible mark on all those involved. For some, it was a loss. For others, a long-awaited justice. But the truth remains the same. The struggle for dignity is a battle that cannot be stopped. We want to know what you think about this story. What do you think about what happened? Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? Share your experiences in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us. Each of your comments helps us to highlight the problem and show that such behavior is unacceptable. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like so that more people can learn about these situations. We appreciate each of you and are grateful for your support. We wish you a good day and peace in your soul. Remember that together we can change the world for the better.